The study smelled of ink gone dry and lamp oil that had burned to nothing. Margaret Hale stood in the doorway with her single carpetbag pressed against her hip, counting. 12 shelves, half of them empty. One desk, its surface buried under a disorder of papers that had clearly not been touched in months. A brass scale sat at the corner of the desk, its two pans tilted unevenly, one weighed down by a stack of coins green with tarnish. Dust floated in the shaft of grey light that fell through the single uncurtained window. She had been told Ashworth Park was a great estate. She had not been told it was dying. Behind her, footsteps. A maid, the only one she had seen since arriving, appeared in the corridor with an expression caught between pity and embarrassment. "His Grace will receive you in the drawing room, miss." Margaret set her carpetbag on the floor beside the study door. She did not move to follow. "How many staff remain?" The maid blinked. "Miss? In this house, how many people work here?" "6, miss. 7 with cook." Margaret counted the doors she had passed walking from the entrance hall. 14 rooms on the ground floor alone. 7 servants for a house built for 40. She picked up her carpetbag and followed the maid down a corridor where every third sconce held no candle. The drawing room was cold. A fire had been laid but not lit, and the furniture wore dust covers on 3 of its 4 settees, as though the room had been partially undressed and then abandoned mid-task. A man stood by the mantelpiece with his back to the door, one hand braced against the marble. He was tall, dark-haired, dressed in a coat that had been well made but showed wear at the cuffs. When he turned, Margaret saw a face that was handsome in the way of men who have stopped sleeping. Strong bones undermined by shadows beneath the eyes. "Miss Hale." He did not bow. His gaze moved over her plain grey dress, her worn boots, her hair pinned without ornament. She watched him catalogue her and arrive at a conclusion. "I'm Ashworth. I was told you required a position." "I was told you required a companion for your sister." "I do." He gestured toward a chair. "Please." Margaret did not sit. She stood with her hands folded, her back straight, and counted the paintings that had been removed from the walls. She could see their ghosts, rectangles of darker wallpaper where frames had hung. 4 missing from this room alone. "Your sister is not here." "She is visiting our aunt in Bath. She returns in a fortnight." "Then what am I to do for a fortnight?" Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of discomfort quickly buried. "You are welcome to settle in. Explore the grounds. The library is at your disposal." "The library?" Margaret looked at the dust covers, the unlit fire, the bare rectangles on the walls. "Your Grace, why are paintings missing from this room?" His hand tightened on the mantelpiece. Just a fraction. Just enough. Reframing. "All 4 at once?" "Miss Hale." His voice cooled by several degrees. "You have been engaged as a companion, not an auditor." Margaret met his gaze. She held it the way she held everything, with a stillness that made other people shift their weight. "Of course, Your Grace. I shall confine my curiosity to the library." She turned and walked out, her footsteps measured and even on the stone floor. Behind her, she heard him exhale. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath without knowing it. The bedroom they had given her was on the 2nd floor, east wing, at the end of a corridor where the carpet runner had been rolled up and removed. The room itself was clean, but spare. A bed, a washstand, a wardrobe that held the smell of cedar and emptiness. Margaret set her carpetbag on the bed and opened it. 3 dresses, 2 of them mended. Undergarments, a comb, a leather-bound ledger that had belonged to her father, its pages dense with his handwriting. Crop yields, livestock tallies, repair costs, weather patterns, debts owed and debts paid. She had kept his farm running for 4 years after his death. She had kept it running until there was nothing left to run. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palm flat against the ledger's cover. The leather was warm from being packed against her clothes. She could still smell the faintest trace of her father's study: ink, lamp oil, the particular mustiness of a room where a man spent his life making numbers tell the truth. 7 servants, missing paintings, a brass scale with tarnished coins, a duke who flinched when asked simple questions. Margaret Hale had been running failing estates since she was 19 years old. She knew what ruin smelled like. It smelled like ink gone dry and lamp oil that had burned to nothing. The fortnight stretched before her like an empty ledger page. She was not the sort of woman who explored grounds. She rose before dawn. The house was silent except for the kitchen, where cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Alcott, was kneading bread by candlelight. Margaret stood in the kitchen doorway and counted 12 loaves worth of dough for 7 people. Mrs. Alcott's hands were red and chapped, the knuckles swollen. "You bake for the tenants." Mrs. Alcott looked up, startled. Flour dusted her forearms. "Someone must, miss. They've had no grain allotment since Michaelmas." "That was 5 months ago." "Aye." Margaret stepped into the kitchen. The flagstones were cold under her thin-soled shoes, and the air smelled of yeast and wood smoke. "Whose responsibility is the grain allotment?" "Mr. Poole, the steward." Mrs. Alcott's hands never stopped working the dough. Knead, turn, press, knead, turn, press. "He manages all the estate accounts." "Where is Mr. Poole?" "He keeps rooms in the village, comes up to the house twice a week." Margaret filed this. A steward who did not live on the estate. A grain allotment 5 months overdue. Tenants fed by a cook who baked before dawn on her own initiative. She pulled a chair to the kitchen table, sat down, and began helping Mrs. Alcott shape loaves. Her hands remembered the motion. She had baked bread every morning for 4 years on her father's farm, rising in the dark to feed workers she could barely afford to pay. Mrs. Alcott watched her work. "You've done this before." "I have done most things before." Margaret pressed her thumb into the dough, testing its give. "Mrs. Alcott, how long has this estate been in difficulty?" "I couldn't say, miss." "You could. You choose not to." Margaret said it without accusation. A simple observation, delivered with the same stillness she brought to everything. "I am not asking you to betray a confidence. I am asking because someone is baking 12 loaves before dawn for tenants who should not need them." Mrs. Alcott's hands stilled on the dough. She looked at Margaret with an expression that was not quite trust, not quite hope, but something in the territory between them. 3 years, miss. Maybe 4. It's gotten worse since the old steward died and Mr. Poole took over." "When did Mr. Poole take over?" 2 years come June." 2 years. Margaret shaped another loaf, her fingers precise and steady. 2 years was long enough to bleed an estate dry, if no one was watching the books. She found the study unlocked. The door opened with a creak that suggested it had not been oiled in months, and the smell hit her again. Dried ink, spent lamp oil, paper going yellow. Morning light fell across the desk in a pale wash, illuminating the chaos of ledgers and correspondence. Margaret stood in the doorway and counted the stacks. 7 distinct piles, none of them organized by any system she could identify. The brass scale sat where she had seen it yesterday, its uneven pans catching the light. She crossed the room. She did not touch the papers. Instead, she knelt beside the desk and examined the scale. One pan held tarnished coins. The other held nothing. She lifted a coin, turned it in her fingers. It was a guinea, but the weight was wrong. Too light by a fraction she could feel in her fingertips, the way her father had taught her to feel it when buyers came to the farm with suspect payment. "What are you doing?" Margaret did not flinch. She set the coin back in the pan and rose, turning with the controlled deliberation that was her particular gift. A movement so unhurried, it forced the other person to wait. The Duke of Ashworth stood in the corridor, his hair uncombed, his cravat untied, a cup of tea steaming in one hand. He looked as though he had been awake for hours without managing to become functional. "I was examining your desk scale." "The study is not part of the library." "No." She clasped her hands in front of her. "It is not." "Then you have no reason to be here." "Your Grace." Margaret held his gaze. "How often do you review your estate accounts?" The question landed like a stone in still water. She watched the ripples cross his face. Surprise, then irritation, then something rawer underneath. Shame, perhaps. Or exhaustion so deep it had become indistinguishable from shame. "That is not your concern." "When did you last sit at that desk?" "Miss Hale, when?" He set his teacup on the corridor table. The porcelain clicked against wood. "I don't recall." "The dust on the chair says it has been months. The ledgers are unsorted. The ink in the well is dry." She gestured toward the desk without turning away from him. "You have a steward who lives in the village and visits twice a week. You have tenants without grain allotments. You have paintings removed from your walls." She paused. "I am not an auditor, but I can count." His jaw tightened. She watched the muscle work beneath the skin, the effort it cost him not to dismiss her outright. He was proud. She had known that from the moment she saw him, standing at the mantelpiece with his hand braced against it. A man holding himself upright by the architecture of his own house. "You were engaged as a companion." "Your sister is in Bath." "And when she returns?" "When she returns, I will be the most attentive companion she has ever had. Until then, I am a woman with nothing to do in a house that is falling apart, and I would very much like to see your ledgers." The silence between them was a physical thing. It filled the corridor like cold air. Margaret stood in it without shifting, without blinking, without offering him a gracious retreat. She had learned long ago that silence was a room most people could not bear to occupy. She could live in it. "You would not understand them," he said at last, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "Try me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked past her into the study, set his teacup on the desk, and pulled the chair back. Dust rose in a small cloud. He sat down, opened the top ledger, and pushed it toward the empty side of the desk. Margaret pulled a second chair from the corner of the room. She sat across from him. The brass scale stood between them, its pans still uneven. She opened the ledger and began to read. The numbers were a disaster. Not the honest disaster of a bad harvest or a market collapse. Margaret knew those intimacies well. But the particular disaster of neglect, compounded by something she could not yet name. She ran her finger down a column of expenses and felt the wrongness before she could articulate it. Feed costs for livestock that the estate no longer kept. Maintenance charges for buildings she had walked past that morning and seen standing empty with broken windows. A monthly payment to a London supplier that appeared in every ledger for the past 18 months without a single corresponding receipt. She did not say any of this. Not yet. She turned pages. She counted. She let the silence of the study fill with the scratch of her fingernail against paper and the distant sound of Mrs. Alcott's bread pans in the kitchen below. "You see it," he said. His voice was quiet. He was watching her face with the particular attention of a man who has been drowning and has just noticed someone standing on the shore. "I see numbers that do not add up." She looked up from the ledger. "But you already knew that." "I knew something was wrong. I am not—" He stopped. His hand went to the back of his neck. "My father managed the estate. When he died, I trusted Poole." "Why?" "He came recommended. He had references." "From whom?" "My cousin, Lord Everett Ashworth." Margaret filed the name. She turned back to the ledger. "Your Grace, this column here, feed costs for 40 head of cattle. How many head do you currently keep?" He stared at the column, as though it were written in a foreign language. Perhaps a dozen. I would have to ask Poole. And this? She pointed to a line item. Monthly payment to Harwich & Sons, London. What do they supply? I don't know. You have been paying them £23 a month for 18 months. That is £414 to a company whose services you cannot name. The colour drained from his face. It happened slowly, like tide going out, the flush of embarrassment receding to leave something pale and exposed underneath. His hands, resting on the desk, curled into loose fists. I should have. Yes. Margaret said it without cruelty. A fact, not a judgment. But you didn't. And now we are here. She closed the ledger. She rested her hands flat on its cover. The leather was cool under her palms, and the smell of old ink rose from the pages like a memory. I managed my father's farm for 4 years after he died. It was failing when he left it to me, and I held it together until the land was sold to pay his debts. I know how to read a ledger. I know how to find where money goes when it is not going where it should. She held his gaze. Let me help you. His eyes, grey, she noticed for the first time, the grey of winter sky before snow, moved across her face, as though searching for the lie, the angle, the hidden motive. Margaret sat still and let him search. She had nothing to hide. She had nothing at all, except the ability to count. Why? He asked. Because 7 servants cannot maintain a house built for 40, and tenants should not depend on a cook's charity for bread. Something broke behind his eyes. Not dramatically, a quiet fracture, the kind that lets light in rather than letting structure out. He nodded once. The ledgers are yours. Margaret pulled the stack toward her. The brass scale trembled with the motion, its pans swinging gently, and she reached out and steadied it with one finger. When she lifted her hand, the pans hung level. 3 days passed. Margaret worked in the study from dawn until the light failed, at which point she lit the lamp herself, filled the oil reservoir from the store she had found in the cellar, and kept working. She organized the 7 piles of chaos into a system. Income on the left, expenses on the right, correspondence sorted by date in the center. The brass scale she cleaned with vinegar and a soft cloth until the brass gleamed. She used it to weigh coins, comparing the guineas in the pan against a verified weight she borrowed from Mrs. Alcott's kitchen scales. 3 of the coins were light, not clipped, something subtler. She set them aside without comment. The Duke appeared each morning. At first he stood in the doorway, watching her work with the uncertain posture of a man who has surrendered control of a room he technically owns. By the second day, he sat across from her. By the third, he was reading the letters she sorted for him, asking questions she answered without looking up from her columns. This payment to the farrier. We haven't used a farrier since we sold the carriage horses. I know. Margaret's pen moved steadily down the page. Add it to the list. What list? The list of payments for services you do not receive. He was quiet for a moment. She heard him set the letter down. She heard him breathe. How long is the list? I will tell you when I have finished counting. She counted. She counted for 3 more days, and with each day the study transformed around her. She opened the curtains. She swept the floor herself when no maid appeared to do it. She found a tin of beeswax in the kitchen and polished the desk until the wood grain showed. Dark walnut, beautifully figured. A desk made by a craftsman for a man who valued precision. The brass scale sat in its place of honor, both pans level now, gleaming in light that fell clean through washed windows. On the evening of the 6th day, she sat across from the Duke with a single sheet of paper between them. The lamp burned steadily. She had trimmed the wick that morning, and the smell of fresh ink and warm oil filled the study like a living thing. £237 per quarter, she said. That is what your estate is paying for goods and services that do not exist. He stared at the number. His hand found the edge of the desk and gripped it. Nearly £1,000 a year. Margaret folded her hands on the paper. Your Grace, your steward is stealing from you. The word landed in the quiet room like a hammer on glass. She watched him absorb it. The shock first, then the rage rising behind it, then the shame that came rushing in to drown the rage. His jaw clenched, his eyes closed. You are certain? I am certain. Every fabricated expense routes through the same mechanism. Invoices from companies that either do not exist or have no record of supplying this estate. I wrote to 3 of them. 2 letters were returned undeliverable. The third was answered by a confused clerk who has never heard of Ashworth Park. She paused. Mr. Poole has been systematically embezzling from this estate for at least 2 years. The Duke stood. His chair scraped back against the floor, the first sudden movement she had seen him make. He walked to the window and pressed both palms flat against the glass. The cold of it must have seared his skin, but he did not pull away. I trusted him. Yes. My cousin recommended him. My own family. Margaret said nothing to that. She sat with her hands folded, watching his back, watching the rigid line of his shoulders and the way his breath fogged the glass in uneven bursts. The lamp flickered. Shadows moved across the shelves she had organized. What do I do? He turned from the window. His face was stripped bare. No composure, no pride, no ducal distance. Just a man standing in a room that a woman he had called a charity case had made habitable, asking her how to save what was left of his life. You dismiss Poole. You audit every transaction for the past 2 years. You recover what can be recovered. She stood, gathering the papers into a neat stack. And you stop selling paintings. A sound escaped him. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. Something in between that lived in the territory of exhaustion and relief. You notice the paintings. I notice everything, Your Grace. It is the only skill poverty leaves you. She walked past him toward the door, and as she did, his hand moved. Not to touch her, but toward her. A gesture begun and arrested, his fingers closing on empty air. She saw it from the corner of her eye. She did not stop, but she felt it, the almost touch, like heat from a fire she had not yet decided to sit beside. Mr. Poole arrived on Tuesday. Margaret heard the front door open from the study where she sat working, and she counted his footsteps in the corridor, heavy, confident, the stride of a man who believed himself unobserved. She did not look up when he passed the open study door, but she felt him pause. She felt his gaze land on the organized shelves, the polished desk, the gleaming scale, and she felt the exact moment recognition hit him like a change in air pressure. Who are you? Margaret looked up. Poole was a thick man, with a florid face and small eyes that moved constantly, cataloguing the room the way she had catalogued it. Except where she had been counting what was broken, he was counting what had been fixed. Miss Hale, I am engaged as a companion to His Grace's sister. Lady Catherine is not in residence. No, Margaret returned to her ledger. She is not. Poole stepped into the study. He smelled of tobacco and rain, and something else, something sweet and cloying that she would later identify as the pomade he used to slick his hair. These are estate accounts. Yes? You have reorganized them. They required reorganizing. Miss Hale. His voice had taken on an edge. Estate management is my responsibility. These documents are confidential. Margaret set down her pen. She folded her hands. She looked up at him with the particular stillness that made men twice her size step back. Poole did not step back, but she saw his weight shift, a fraction of an inch, a redistribution of confidence. Mr. Poole, she said, Who is Harwich and Sons? The silence lasted 3 heartbeats. She counted them. A London supplier. What do they supply? Various estate materials, hardware, timber. I see. And the farrier charges appearing monthly for the past 14 months? We retain a farrier for tenant horses. Which tenants? I would have to check my records. Yes. Margaret picked up her pen. I imagine you would. Poole's face had gone the particular shade of red that comes not from embarrassment, but from the sudden awareness that one is standing in a trap. He looked at the ledgers spread open on the desk. He looked at the neat columns of figures Margaret had compiled. He looked at the brass scale sitting between them, its pans perfectly level, catching the light. Where is His Grace? I believe he is with his steward, which is to say, he is coming here. Footsteps in the corridor. The Duke appeared in the doorway, and Margaret watched the scene arrange itself. Poole turning to face his employer with a smile already assembling on his mouth, the Duke standing rigid with a sheet of paper in his hand, the study between them organized and clean and smelling of fresh ink. Every lie it had hidden, now laid bare on a polished desk. Poole. The Duke's voice was level. We need to discuss Harwich and Sons. Margaret excused herself. She took her own notes and walked to the kitchen, where she sat at Mrs. Alcott's table and listened to the raised voices echoing down the corridor. She did not need to be present. The numbers spoke for themselves. That was the mercy and the cruelty of arithmetic. It did not require conviction, only counting. When the front door slammed 20 minutes later, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The kitchen smelled of bread and wood ash. Her hands lay flat on the table, steady as they had been every day since she was 19 years old, and had taken her dead father's ledger from his desk and opened it to the first page and begun to count what was left. The days after Poole's dismissal were relentless. Margaret and the Duke sat across from each other in the study from morning to night, untangling 2 years of falsified accounts. She taught him to read his own ledgers, not as a duke examining reports, but as a farmer's daughter examining survival. Run your finger down the column. Stop when the number feels wrong. Check it against the source. Check the source against reality. Feel wrong? He looked up from a page of grain tallies, a smudge of ink on his thumb. Numbers don't feel like anything. They do if you are the one who will go hungry when they lie. Margaret leaned across the desk and pointed. Here. This figure says you purchased 40 bushels of seed grain in October. Did 40 bushels arrive? I don't. Ask your tenants. They will know. They always know. He rode out the next morning and came back in the afternoon with mud on his boots and a look on his face she had not seen before. Anger refined by contact with the people it was meant to protect. He stood in the study doorway, still in his riding coat, and said, 20 bushels. They received 20. And the other 20? Sold. Poole sold the surplus to a dealer in Weybridge. He pulled off his gloves, finger by finger, and dropped them on the desk beside the scale. Mrs. Alcott's bread. That's why she bakes 12 loaves. Yes. He sat down heavily. The chair creaked. He put his head in his hands, and Margaret watched his shoulders curve inward, the architecture of pride finally buckling. She did not reach for him. She did not offer comfort. She picked up her pen, dipped it in ink that was fresh because she had mixed it that morning, and continued writing. After a while, he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed but dry. You are very calm about all of this. I have done this before. Your father's farm. My father's farm was smaller. The betrayal was the same size. She met his eyes. A man my father trusted sold our best livestock and pocketed the difference. I found it in the books after my father died. By then the damage was too deep to repair. How old were you? 19. And you managed it alone. I will not pretend that was noble, Your Grace. It was necessary. There was no one else. She set down her pen. The nib clicked against the inkwell. Necessity is not nobility, it is just necessity. He was looking at her the way she had seen men look at locked doors, with the dawning understanding that what was behind them was worth the effort of finding the key. It made something warm and dangerous stir in the space behind her sternum. She ignored it. Margaret. It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it in his voice, lower than his usual register, rougher, settled against her skin like a hand she had not invited. Your Grace. Edward. Your Grace. She picked up her pen. The Weybridge accounts, if you please. She saw the corner of his mouth move. Not a smile, the ghost of one, haunting the face of a man who had forgotten how. He opened the next ledger, and they worked in a silence that had lost its cold edges and become something else. A shared room, a shared task, the quiet that lives between people who have stopped performing and started simply being in the same space. The lamp burned between them. The brass scale caught its light. Margaret counted the hours by the oil level dropping in the reservoir, and when the flame began to gutter, it was Edward who rose to refill it, his hand brushing hers as he reached across the desk. Neither of them pulled away. Neither of them acknowledged it. But the lamp burned brighter after, as though the oil he had poured in carried some warmth his fingers had left on the brass. Lady Catherine arrived on a Thursday, announced by the clatter of a carriage and a voice that carried through the entrance hall with the penetrating clarity of a woman who had never been ignored in her life. Edward! The road from Bath is an absolute ruin, and I demand tea before I speak to anyone about anything. Margaret was in the study, transcribing figures. She closed the ledger, capped the ink, and smoothed her dress, the blue one, the only one without visible mending, reserved for occasions when first impressions mattered. She counted her breaths, 3 in, 3 out. She stood. Catherine was small, dark-haired like her brother, and possessed of the kind of energy that made rooms feel too confined. She stood in the drawing room, which now had its dust covers removed, its fire lit, its surviving paintings straightened, pulling off her gloves while a maid struggled with her trunk. You must be Miss Hale. Catherine's gaze was sharp and assessing. My brother wrote to me about you. Did he? He said you were reorganizing his life. I am reorganizing his ledgers. His life is his own concern. Catherine laughed, a bright, startled sound. Oh, I am going to like you. She dropped her gloves on the settee. He also said you discovered that odious Mr. Poole was a thief. Is that true? Mr. Poole's accounts contain significant irregularities. That is a very polite way of saying he was robbing us blind. Catherine sat down without being invited to, the way people do in houses they consider theirs. Miss Hale, you should know that my cousin Everett recommended Poole, and my cousin Everett has been waiting for this estate to fail for as long as I can remember. Margaret felt the information enter her bloodstream like cold water. She sat down across from Catherine with careful precision. Why would your cousin want the estate to fail? Because if Edward cannot maintain it, the entail reverts, and Everett is next in the line of succession. Catherine poured herself tea from a pot that had gone cold, drank it without complaint, and fixed Margaret with a look. You look like someone who has just been given a piece of a puzzle she was already solving. I look like someone who is listening. Yes, you do that unnervingly well. Margaret allowed herself the fraction of a smile. Lady Catherine, how much do you know about your cousin's finances? I know he has debts. I know he frequents gaming establishments my brother would never enter. And I know he visited this estate 3 times in the past year, always meeting with Poole, always when Edward was away. Catherine set down her cold tea. I was going to tell Edward, but telling Edward things he does not want to hear is rather like telling the tide to reconsider. Then tell me. Margaret folded her hands. Tell me everything." The weeks that followed took the shape of a campaign. Margaret and Edward worked in the study each morning, tallying recoverable losses, writing to creditors, negotiating extensions on debts that Poole's theft had made urgent. In the afternoons, Margaret walked the estate with Catherine, who proved to be an unexpectedly sharp observer of every tenant farmer's mood, every fence in disrepair, every field left fallow that should have been planted. She counted the fallow fields. 7 of 23. Nearly a third of the estate's productive land lying dormant, while tenants went hungry and a cook baked bread before dawn. "We plant them," Margaret told Edward that evening, standing at the study desk with a map of the estate spread between them. The lamp threw warm light across her hands as she traced the field boundaries. "Spring planting begins in 3 weeks. If we hire day labourers from the village and use the seed reserves, the real reserves, not Poole's phantom purchases, we can put 4 of these fields into production by April." "With what money?" "With the money you recover from Poole's fraudulent suppliers. I have drafted letters to each one, demanding return of payment for goods never delivered. 3 have already responded." She pulled the letters from a stack and laid them beside the map. £57 recovered so far. Enough for seed and labour, if we are careful. He stared at the map, at the letters, at her hands resting steady on the desk. The brass scale sat between them as it always did, its pans level, its surface gleaming. "You have been here 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, and you have done more than I managed in 2 years. You are managing grief. That is a different kind of accounting." She pulled the map closer and circled a field in pencil. "This one first. It has the best drainage." His hand covered hers on the map. She felt the warmth of it, the calluses on his palm that she had not expected from a duke, the slight roughness of skin that had been doing more manual work than his station required, because he could not afford to pay others to do it. Her fingers stilled under his. "Margaret." His voice was low, close. The lamp oil scented the air between them. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not come." "You would have continued," she said. Her voice was steady. Her pulse was not. She could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, in the hand trapped beneath his. "You would have continued because that is what people do when there is no alternative. It is not admirable. It is simply what there is." "That is the least romantic thing anyone has ever said to me." "I am not a romantic, Your Grace." "Edward." She looked up at him. The lamplight caught the grey of his eyes and turned it silver. His face was closer than she had calculated, close enough that she could see the precise moment his gaze dropped to her mouth and returned. Close enough that the smell of him, wool, soap, the faintest trace of the horse he had ridden that morning, mingled with the lamp oil and ink that had become the study's signature. "Edward," she said. It was the first time, and the sound of it changed the temperature of the room. He leaned toward her. She did not lean back, but she placed her free hand on his chest, not pushing, not pulling, measuring. The beat of his heart against her palm was quick and strong. "Not yet," she said. He stopped. He breathed. His hand tightened on hers and then released. "Not yet," he repeated. "There is a great deal of work to do." She withdrew her hand from his chest. She picked up the pencil. "This field. Best drainage. We start tomorrow." He smiled. It was the first real smile she had seen from him. Not the ghost, not the attempt, but the thing itself, breaking across his face like light through a cleaned window. She looked away before it could settle into her permanently. She circled another field on the map and began to count the acres. Lord Everett Ashworth arrived without invitation on a morning when the study windows were open to an April breeze and the smell of turned earth carried in from the fields Margaret had ordered planted. She was at the desk, reviewing the week's planting costs, when she heard hoofbeats on the gravel drive. Not the familiar rhythm of Edward's horse, but something faster, harder, the cadence of a man who rides to claim rather than to arrive. She set down her pen. She counted the seconds between the hoofbeats stopping and the front door opening. 4. He had not waited for a groom. The voice that carried down the corridor was smooth, educated, and carried the particular warmth of a man who practices warmth the way other men practice fencing, technically, strategically, and with intent to wound. "Edward, cousin, I heard you've had some trouble with Poole. Terrible business. I came as soon as I could." Margaret remained at the desk. She folded her hands over the ledger and waited. Edward's voice lower. "Everett, this is unexpected. Family shouldn't need an invitation. Not at a time like this." Footsteps approaching. 2 sets. "I understand you've been managing things yourself. Admirable. But surely you need proper help. A qualified man. I know several." They reached the study doorway. Margaret looked up and met Lord Everett's gaze, and in the half-second before his social mask assembled itself, she saw it. Recognition. Not of her face, of the organized shelves, the clean desk, the polished scale, the open ledger with its columns of damning arithmetic. Recognition of the fact that someone was watching. "And who is this?" Everett stepped into the study. He was tall, fair-haired, handsome in a way that was all surface, the kind of face that photographs well and means nothing. His smile reached his mouth, but not his eyes. "Miss Hale." Edward moved to stand beside the desk, beside her. "She has been assisting with the estate accounts." A companion, assisting with accounts. Everett's laugh was perfectly calibrated. How unconventional. "Miss Hale has considerable experience in estate management." "I'm sure she does." Everett's gaze moved to the ledger open on the desk. Margaret watched him read the page upside down, quickly, efficiently, the way a man reads when he knows exactly what numbers to look for. "Well, I must say, it's a relief to know someone is keeping an eye on things. Poor Poole. I never would have suspected." "You recommended him," Margaret said. The words fell into the room like a coin onto the brass scale. Small, precise, and heavy enough to tip the balance. Everett's smile held, but his eyes changed. Something behind them went flat and cold, the way water goes flat before it freezes. "I recommended a man with excellent references. One can hardly be blamed for another's moral failings." "No," Margaret agreed. "One can hardly be blamed. Unless, of course, one benefits from them." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Edward stood very still beside her. Everett's smile remained fixed, a mask held in place by force of will. "Miss Hale." Everett's voice dropped to a register that was meant to intimidate. Low, quiet, threaded with the particular authority of a man who has never been challenged by a woman in a gray dress. "I hope you are not suggesting." "I am not suggesting anything, Lord Everett. I am stating that your former recommended steward embezzled nearly £1,000 per year from this estate, and that you stand to inherit this estate should it fail." She unfolded her hands and rested them flat on the desk, on either side of the open ledger. "I am very good at counting, my lord. It is, as you say, unconventional." Everett looked at Edward. "Are you going to let your companion speak to me this way?" Edward pulled a chair to the desk and sat down. He picked up the pen Margaret had set aside. "I am going to let my estate manager speak to you however she sees fit." He opened the next ledger. "Stay for dinner if you like. The accounts will be here when you leave." Everett did not stay for dinner. Margaret watched him ride away from the study window, his horse's hooves throwing gravel, his posture rigid with the particular fury of a man who has been seen clearly for the first time. She counted the seconds until he disappeared around the bend of the drive. 12. "He will come back," she said. "I know." Edward stood beside her at the window. Their shoulders nearly touched. You called yourself my estate manager. You called me your estate manager. I did. He turned to look at her. Was I wrong? Margaret looked at the study. Her study now, in every way that mattered. The shelves she had organized, the desk she had polished, the scale she had cleaned and calibrated, the ink she mixed each morning, the lamp she filled each evening. The room that had been a mausoleum of neglect and was now the beating heart of an estate clawing its way back from ruin. No, she said. You were not wrong. The next weeks burned with the particular intensity of a race against a clock whose face you cannot see. Margaret tallied planting costs, negotiated with creditors, drafted contracts for day labourers, and wrote a 12-page report documenting Poole's embezzlement with evidence sufficient for legal action. She worked in the study until the lamp guttered. Edward worked beside her. Their hands brushed across the desk, and neither of them flinched. Their knees touched beneath it, and neither of them moved apart. Catherine, watching from the doorway one evening, said, "You two are either going to save this estate or set it on fire. Possibly both." "We are working," Margaret said without looking up. "You are always working. That is exactly my concern." Catherine disappeared down the corridor, and Margaret heard her laughing to herself. The warm, knowing laugh of a woman who sees what the people in front of her have not yet admitted. The letter arrived on a morning in late April, when the first green shoots were visible in the eastern fields, and the study smelled of fresh ink and the lilac bush blooming outside the open window. Edward brought it to the desk, his face drained of colour, and set it beside the brass scale without speaking. Margaret picked it up. She read it once, quickly, and then again slowly, the way she read ledgers, letting the wrongness surface. Lord Everett Ashworth had filed a petition with the Court of Chancery, claiming financial mismanagement of the Ashworth estate and requesting appointment of a court-designated trustee. The petition cited the estate's debts, the dismissal of the steward, and, Margaret's hand tightened on the paper, the irregular influence of an unqualified woman over estate affairs. The court date was set for 3 weeks hence. If the petition succeeded, Edward would lose control of his own estate. Everett, as next in line, would be appointed trustee. He is not trying to inherit a bankrupt estate, Margaret said slowly. He is trying to inherit a recovered one. Edward stared at her. Think about it. She set the letter down and pressed her finger to the desktop, the way she pointed at ledger entries, precise, definitive. He placed Poole here to bleed you dry. When I discovered the theft and you dismissed Poole, Everett lost his mechanism. So now he changes strategy. He files the petition before you can fully recover. The court appoints him trustee. He takes control of an estate that I have spent 2 months repairing. She looked up. He gets everything. The recovered rents, the planted fields, the cleared debts, all of it. Edward sat down. He sat down the way buildings settle, slowly, irreversibly, with the sound that might have been the chair, or might have been something inside him giving way. Can he win? He can if we cannot prove the embezzlement was orchestrated. A dismissed steward is evidence of mismanagement. A conspiracy to defraud is evidence of malice, and malice by the very man petitioning for control. She opened the desk drawer and pulled out the file she had compiled. I have the accounts. I have the fraudulent invoices. I have the letters from suppliers, confirming they never did business with this estate. What I need is the connection between Poole and Everett. Written proof that they worked together. Where would that be? In Poole's rooms. In the village. Margaret stood. She straightened her cuffs. She checked the ink level in the well, the oil in the lamp, the position of the scale. Rituals she had built over 8 weeks. The small liturgy of a woman who keeps chaos at bay through precision. I'm going to find it. Not alone. Your Grace, Edward. Edward. She stopped. She looked at him across the desk, across the scale. across the 8 weeks of numbers and silence, and the slow, unspoken thing growing between them, like the green shoots in the eastern fields. I have done most things alone. It is not a principle. It is a habit. Habits can change. They can. She picked up her shawl from the back of the chair. Are you coming? Poole's rooms were above the village tavern, 2 cramped chambers that smelled of tobacco and old wool. The landlord let them in without question when he saw the Duke, and Margaret went straight to the writing desk pushed against the window. She counted the drawers. 4. She opened them one by one. The first 3 held nothing useful. Personal correspondence, tavern bills, a deck of playing cards. The 4th was locked. Margaret pulled a hairpin from her hair and worked it into the mechanism with the practiced ease of a woman who had opened her father's locked desk drawer at 19 to discover exactly how much debt he had left her. The lock clicked. The drawer opened. Inside, a bundle of letters tied with brown string and a leather notebook. Margaret untied the string. The letters were from Lord Everett Ashworth. She read the first one aloud, her voice flat and steady in the dim room. Dear Poole, the quarterly figures are satisfactory. Continue the Harwich invoices but increase the amount by 10%. My cousin does not review the accounts closely enough to notice. Deposit my share in the usual place. E.A. Edward stood behind her. She felt his stillness, different from hers, which was a weapon. His was the stillness of a man absorbing a blow. There are 12 letters, she said. She counted them. Spanning 22 months. Each one details specific instructions for embezzlement and references payments made to Everett. She opened the notebook. Inside, in Poole's cramped handwriting, was a record of every payment. Dates, amounts, and a column labeled simply E.A. with corresponding figures. A shadow ledger. A confession in arithmetic. This is enough, Margaret said. She closed the notebook. She tied the letters back together. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not. This is more than enough. Edward's hand found her shoulder. His grip was firm, warm through the fabric of her dress, and she felt the weight of it. Not restraining, not guiding, anchoring. The touch of a man who needs to confirm that the person beside him is real. Margaret. His voice was rough. I need to say something. Not now. She stood, tucking the letters and notebook into her carpet bag. After. When this is finished. And if I cannot wait until after? She turned to face him. The room was dim, the light falling through a dirty window, the smell of tobacco and old wool pressed close around them. His face was near hers. His hand still rested on her shoulder, his thumb tracing a line along the ridge of bone. Then you will learn to wait, she said quietly, because I will not hear what you want to say while we are standing in the room of the man who tried to destroy you. You deserve better than that. I deserve better than that. His hand tightened, then released. He stepped back. After, he said. After. The court hearing was held in the village assembly room on a grey morning in May. Margaret arrived with Edward and Catherine, carrying a leather case that held 8 weeks of organised accounts, 12 letters in Everett's handwriting, and Poole's shadow ledger. She wore her blue dress. She had ironed it that morning in the kitchen, pressing the fabric smooth with Mrs. Alcott's heavy iron, while the cook watched and said nothing, and set an extra bread roll on her plate. Everett was already seated when they entered, flanked by a London solicitor, whose suit cost more than Margaret's entire wardrobe. He looked at Margaret and smiled the smile she had seen before, warm, practiced, and empty as a false invoice. The magistrate was a stout man named Whitfield who clearly wished he was somewhere else. He reviewed Everett's petition, asked questions in a tone of bureaucratic obligation, and then turned to Edward. Your Grace, you may respond. Edward stood. He looked at Margaret. She gave him the smallest nod, a movement so slight that only someone watching her constantly would have noticed it. He noticed it. "I defer to Miss Hale," he said. "She knows the accounts better than anyone in this room." Everett's solicitor rose. "This is highly irregular. Miss Hale has no legal standing." "Miss Hale has been managing this estate for 2 months," Edward said. "She found the theft. She traced the conspiracy. She recovered the evidence. If this court wants the truth, she is the one to give it." Whitfield looked at Margaret. She stood, smoothing her dress with one deliberate motion, and walked to the front of the room, carrying the leather case. She set it on the table. She opened it. She arranged the documents in the order she had determined: accounts first, then fraudulent invoices, then recovered correspondence, then the letters, then the shadow ledger. Each piece placed with the precision of a woman who had been building this case in her mind since the first morning she smelled dried ink in an abandoned study. "My lord," she addressed the magistrate, "I was engaged as a companion to Lady Catherine Ashworth 8 weeks ago. Upon arrival, I discovered an estate in significant financial distress. With His Grace's permission, I undertook a review of the accounts." She walked Whitfield through it. Every fabricated invoice, every phantom supplier, every missing bushel of grain. She laid Poole's shadow ledger open on the table and pointed to the column marked E.A. "These are payments made to Lord Everett Ashworth," she said, "corresponding to every fraudulent transaction over a period of 22 months. She placed the letters beside the ledger. "These are Lord Everett's written instructions to Mr. Poole, directing the embezzlement in specific detail." The room had gone silent. Everett's solicitor was leafing through the letters with an expression of dawning horror. Everett himself sat rigid, the color draining from his face in the slow, terrible way Margaret had seen once before, on the face of the man who had stolen from her father. "The petitioner," Margaret said, "is not seeking to protect this estate from mismanagement. He is seeking to acquire an estate that his own criminal conspiracy failed to destroy." She closed the leather case. She folded her hands. She stood in the stillness she had cultivated since she was 19 years old. The stillness that said, "I have counted everything. I have missed nothing. I will not move until you have heard what the numbers say." Whitfield dismissed the petition in 11 minutes. He referred Lord Everett's conduct to the Crown Prosecutor. Everett left the room without looking at anyone, his solicitor trailing behind like a man walking away from an explosion. In the corridor outside, Edward caught Margaret's hand. She let him hold it. His fingers laced through hers, firm, warm, slightly ink-stained from the morning's work, because even on the day of the hearing, he had been in the study at dawn, reviewing the figures she had organized, making sure he understood every number she would present. Margaret. Not yet. But she was smiling. She felt it on her own face, like a foreign language she was only now remembering how to speak. Almost, but not yet. Catherine, walking 3 steps behind them, said nothing. But Margaret heard her exhale, a long, satisfied breath, the sound of a woman watching 2 people arrive at the conclusion she had seen coming for weeks. The study was warm when they returned. Someone, Mrs. Alcott, Margaret suspected, had lit the fire and left a tray of bread and cheese on the sideboard. The lamp was already burning, its flame steady, and the smell of ink and warm oil wrapped around Margaret like an embrace she had not known she was waiting for. She set the leather case on the desk beside the brass scale. She ran her finger along the scale's arm, smooth, warm from the firelight, balanced. She had cleaned it with vinegar her first week here. She had calibrated it against Mrs. Alcott's kitchen weights. She had placed it at the center of the desk because it reminded her that fairness was not a feeling, but a measurement, and measurements could be learned. "Margaret?" Edward stood in the doorway. The firelight caught the planes of his face, the grey of his eyes, the way his hand rested against the doorframe, not bracing himself, Not this time. Steadying himself, the way a man steadies himself before saying something he cannot take back. You once told me that necessity is not nobility. He stepped into the study. You were wrong. I am rarely wrong. You are wrong about this. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the wool of his coat and the soap on his skin, and the faintest trace of ink on his fingers. You came to this house with a single carpet bag and saved everything in it. Not because anyone asked you to, not because anyone expected it, because you walked into a room and saw that the numbers were wrong, and you could not leave them wrong. That is necessity. That is who you are. His hand rose and touched her face, his thumb against her cheekbone, his fingers curving along her jaw. I am in love with who you are, not the version of you that saved my estate, not the version that demolished my cousin in a courtroom, the version that sits at that desk every morning before dawn and mixes the ink and fills the lamp and cleans the scale, because you believe that precision is a form of care. Margaret's breath caught. She felt it, the hitch in her chest, the heat behind her eyes, the way her body betrayed the stillness she had worn like armor for 9 years. Her hand came up and covered his where it rested against her face. I will not pretend this is simple, she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything to make it steady. I will not pretend that I am not afraid. I will not pretend that loving you does not feel like standing on a ledge I have spent my entire life building walls against. I know. But I will not pretend I don't. She turned her face into his palm. She felt the calluses against her lips. I love you, Edward. I have loved you since you sat down at that desk and let me show you what the numbers meant. I have loved you since you rode out to your tenants and came back angry on their behalf. I have loved you since you called me your estate manager in front of a man who wanted me to be nothing. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been waiting, and a woman who had finally stopped measuring the distance. His arms came around her, and her hands gripped the lapels of his coat, and the brass scale rattled on the desk as they bumped against it, its pans swinging wildly before settling, as they always settled, into balance. The wedding was brief. A Tuesday morning in June, the village church, wildflowers from the estate's own fields tied with kitchen string. Catherine cried. Mrs. Alcott did not cry, but her bread that morning was the finest she had ever baked, and she made enough for every tenant on the estate. 6 months later, the study smelled of fresh ink and lamp oil, and the lavender sachets Margaret had tucked into the desk drawers. Morning light fell through clean windows onto a desk where 2 ledgers lay open. The estate accounts on the left, the household accounts on the right, both in Margaret's hand, both in perfect order. She sat at the desk and ran her finger down the quarterly column. The eastern fields had yielded their first full harvest. The grain allotments had been restored. Mrs. Alcott still baked 12 loaves, but now it was because the household had grown. 3 new servants, a groundskeeper, a proper steward vetted by Margaret herself, with references she had personally verified. The brass scale sat at the center of the desk, its pans level, its surface gleaming. Margaret touched it. A habit now, like counting windows, like mixing ink. A small ritual that meant, the world is measured, and the measurement is fair. Footsteps in the corridor. Edward appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of tea, one of which he set on her side of the desk with the careful precision of a man who has learned that the placement of objects matters to the woman he married. The south tenant's roof repairs are complete, he said, sitting across from her in the chair that had been his since the 2nd day. And the new drainage in the western fields is holding. I know, I have the costs here. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed with her pen. Under budget by £14. Under budget. He shook his head. I did not know that was possible. Most things are possible when someone is counting. He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, the same gesture in the same place that had happened months ago over a map of fallow fields. But the quality of it had changed. Then it had been a question. Now it was a sentence. Declarative, certain, daily. Margaret turned her hand beneath his and interlaced their fingers. The ink on her thumb smudged against his skin. Through the open window, she could smell turned earth and cut grass, and the faint sweetness of the kitchen garden Mrs. Alcott had planted along the south wall. The study was warm. The lamp stood ready on the desk, though it was not yet needed. The morning light was strong enough. She counted the sounds of the house. Catherine playing pianoforte in the drawing room, 3 notes of a scale before laughing at her own mistake. Mrs. Alcott's voice in the kitchen, directing the new kitchen maid. The crunch of gravel as the groundskeeper crossed the drive. A house full of life that had been 8 months ago, a house full of dust and silence and ink gone dry. Margaret squeezed Edward's hand once, firmly, the way you squeeze something to confirm it is real. Then she released it, picked up her pen, and returned to the numbers. The numbers were good. For the first time in years, the numbers were good. And Margaret Ashworth, counted them with the same steady hand that had counted everything else. The cost of ruin, the price of recovery, and the precise, measurable weight of a life that had finally come into balance. If you have ever been the person in the room that no one expected anything from, and then you opened your mouth, or opened a ledger, or simply did the work no one else could do, then you know exactly what Margaret felt the first time she sat at that desk. The quiet power of being underestimated, and choosing not to correct anyone until the numbers spoke for themselves. Tell me in the comments, what is the skill you carry that people do not see until you show them? If this is your first time here, subscribe. We tell stories like this every week. I will see you in the next one.